Now I want you to shift your attention from ADHD symptoms, inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity, to associated problems. You remember problems that have to do with depression, anxiety, perhaps substance use, sleep problems, or behaviors that might be oppositional, for example. So in terms of psychological interventions, what is it that we are going to target to help with these associated problems? That's a real good question, and actually many people in the field of mental health are thinking about this question. And today, one of the main principles that comes out is to focus on regulation mechanisms, and most specifically, emotional regulation mechanisms. Why? Because when we are able to control and regulate our emotions, we are also better able to control ourselves, to control our behaviors, to control our thoughts, and so on. And so we're going to focus specifically on what emotions are, how the activation of our physiology is very much associated to emotions, and also how we may, through cognitive and perhaps meditation techniques, enhance our capacity to emotionally regulate. Okay, so let's start with emotion regulation. So emotions are things that arise in our subjectivity that are usually caused by either external events, or they can also be internal events. We'll come back to that. But the key characteristic that I'd like you to focus on with regards to emotion is the physiological arousal that occurs when you're in an emotional state. So that pattern of arousal is very important. Why? Because you do need some level of activation of arousal to be able to concentrate, to be able to use your attentional skills. If you're too low on arousal, well then you will probably be less concentrated, less able to really gather all your attentional resources. You'll be, for example, bored, or you'll be avoiding thinking about stuff or engaging in more difficult activities, perhaps. And so low physiological arousal is going to be a problem for attention mechanisms. Physiological arousal is also going to be linked to how subjectively you're going to experience the intensity of emotion and also the duration of an emotion. So in terms of intensity, you can also have episodes where you're actually overwhelmed by emotions. So that would be shifting on the other side of the arousal spectrum, where you're actually invaded by emotional experience. And as you'll notice, for example, when you're really angry or when you're really stressed about something, you will have difficulty shifting your attention. You will have difficulties to really be able to flexibly use all your attentional skills. So that's also going to be a problem that's going to be associated with ADHD. So how is it then that we are going to try to help individuals regulate their emotion? Well, one of the key principles of psychological interventions is really to identify the triggers of emotions. Again, as I said before, triggers can be external events, some getting a bad grade, somebody making a comment, or internal events, some thoughts that occur in my mind, or some bodily sensations that can really get me off of my usual mood and can really invade my thoughts and also influence my behavior. So the key here in most psychological interventions that aim emotion regulation is really to identify the triggers, and also to kind of look at the episode and see how these triggers temporally occur and start influencing the arousal of the individual. Okay, so that's going to be one really key principle. But then you might be asking yourself the following question. You might say, well, what happens with individuals that actually have difficulty describing context, describing triggers, describing their internal experience with regards to how their emotions and their arousal typically go overboard or typically deactivate? That's a really good question, actually. And methods like mindfulness are really designed to work on the premises of emotional and self-regulation. Mindfulness comes from the Buddhist tradition. It is associated with the practice of meditation. It is quite popular nowadays, and with ADHD and also associated problems, it is often used in multimodal interventions to strengthen emotion regulation. So what are the principles of mindfulness? The first key psychological process that is targeted in mindfulness is to observe, to train the individual to observe his or her own experience, the kinds of feelings that occur, the kinds of temporal sequences that can also trigger these feelings, the quality and the details in which things present themselves and experience presents itself. So observation is one key. The second is going to be to strengthen and help with description, with describing, with using words, images to give a full body and a full representation to the experience. And the third is going to be to help the individual engage and participate in experience. So one of the problems sometimes is that when we observe and describe experience, it can effectively be a bit overwhelming, and so we can retreat and not engage oneself. So we're going to work through mindfulness in terms of acceptance of the incoming information, regulation, and then engagement in the experience to see how it feels as well. So you see there are actually three different components that one can use to even go and strengthen more the regulation mechanisms. So to summarize, in effect, when we're talking about associated problems, we are moving from the specific ADHD field to more of a transdiagnostic field. And the principles of intervention here are to target regulation mechanisms. So especially emotion regulation mechanisms, and that really has to do with arousal and how emotions activate or deactivate and how we can regulate these activation-deactivation patterns to make attentional processes more available to the individual. And if work on observation, description, and engagement in experience is necessary, then there are also a lot of tools that can help there and that can strengthen self and emotional regulation.